Even though I didn't own an NES, much less a Famicom, until after the turn of the millennium, I did get to play so many games on it from the late 80s onwards that I realized the necessity to do a similar 10 games per episode upgrade as I've done with the C64 and Spectrum so far. But I can't say I have any nostalgia for that many bad NES games, so I'll continue with random games that I can remember. The first game for this first 10 game episode is Yoshi, obviously from Nintendo, released originally in Japan in December 1991 and in other regions in 1992. According to many online sources, the game was actually released as Mario and Yoshi in PAL regions, but I distinctly remember playing the game as Yoshi, so my friend who had it must have had a modified console. No matter, it's still the same game. It's a puzzle game where you control Mario at the bottom of a Tetris-like shaft. Your job is to keep an eye on the blocks that fall down and try to pair them as much as you can. Unlike later falling block puzzle games such as Tetris Attack, similar blocks that are next to each other do not pair up, but instead they have to be on top of each other. Every now and then, two halves of a Yoshi egg will fall down, and you need to have the bottom half seated down before you can combine it with the top half. Just dropping down a top half piece by itself will destroy it, but if you have other blocks piled on top of a bottom half of an egg, you can still use the top egg half to merge the two egg halves together and get rid of a bunch of collateral puzzle blocks while at it. Yoshi, or Mario and Yoshi if you prefer, is one of the better puzzle games for the NES, and as you would expect, it has a fairly traditional two-player mode for a higher entertainment value. Historically, the game might have some additional interest specifically to fans of the Pokemon games, since Yoshi was developed by the same developing company, Game Freak. The other NES game I remember playing on the same friend's NES as Yoshi was an isometric adventure game called Solstice, The Quest for the Staff of Demnos. The game itself didn't really impress me all that much, but that's just my natural distaste for isometric adventure games. What did impress me was hearing Tim Follin's music on the NES, though more specifically, hearing music on the NES that sounded almost like Commodore 64. But that's just Tim Follin being Tim Follin. The game plot offers nothing of interest. It's the same old defeat the evil and save the girl kind of a thing. It's really the way the game evolves that makes it a surprisingly interesting specimen of its kind. Of course, the idea is to pick up objects and use them in various creative ways, but you have some magical potions you can and need to use to make progress. The 4 potions give you temporary invincibility or time freeze, turn invisible objects from the room visible, and destroy all moving things in a room. All the potions have upgrades somewhere in the game, and your jumping ability can also be boosted by magical boots. There are 250 rooms in the game, from which you need to find 6 pieces of the Staff of Demnos to defeat the evil Baron Morbius, so it might take a good while to get your head around everything in Solstice. Because of its presentation, the comfortable controls and the way the game progresses, I find a rare example of an isometric adventure which I actually enjoy in Solstice. Considering the genre was basically invented on the ZX Spectrum, I find it rather funny that you need an NES to play one of the best games in the genre. Now here's a game that took me ages to come to terms with, mostly because of its origins. Bionic Commando was originally an arcade game developed and released by Capcom in 1987, and as such ported to pretty much all the major 8-bit and 16-bit home computers. That's the Bionic Commando I grew up with, having had the C64 version in my collection before the NES game was even released in Europe. The NES Bionic Commando story is an interesting one though. The game is clearly not a direct port, but it is certainly based on the arcade original, and rather more interestingly, Capcom's original Commando from 1985 as well. Super Joe, the protagonist from the original Commando, has been captured by the Empire, the bad guys, and the Federation, the good guys, send you to rescue Super Joe and deal with the Empire's evil master plan. The original Japanese titles might explain a bit more about the connection between the 3 games, Commando being Senjo no Okami, translated Wolf of the Battlefield. the original arcade Bionic Commando being Top Secret in Japanese, and the NES version's original Japanese title is translated as Hitler's Resurrection Top Secret. But of course I learned of this game through the European release. This game features gameplay elements from both Commando and Bionic Commando, so you get the Bionic arm platforming action as well as classic top-down running and shooting action. More importantly though, there are added elements of puzzle adventuring with a fairly free roamable game map, even though you do need to go through the levels in an almost specific order, as well as an inventory similar to Metal Gear or Mega Man, although you can only select your weapons and other items at the beginning of each level. You also need to communicate and wiretap into enemy communications using communications rooms in different locations, which kind of make you wish you were playing Metal Gear instead. To be honest, I didn't get to enjoy the NES Bionic Commando until I played and completed the 2008 remake called Bionic Commando Rearmed. Only then I finally got myself hooked in the NES game as well, even though I had first seen and played it sometime in the early 90s. As a more player-friendly experience though, I would rather recommend the remake, and more specifically because of its cooperative two-player mode, but I have to acknowledge it's still one of the best NES games of all time. Not to be confused with the Commodore 64 game by the same name, a unique little light gun game called Gumshoe caught my attention from a Finnish computer and video gaming yearbook in 1990. As with many other NES games, the original release date predates the European release date by 2 years at least, and without internet, you learn about these games only when they reach your area. Gumshoe was one of those games I didn't really get to play until emulation came along, and even then, mouse didn't really replace a zapper very well, even though it certainly made the shooting much easier. I did see the game in action around the turn of the 90s though, and I can't say how intrigued I was about it as a less than 10-year-old kid. The way the game works is, a detective by the name of Mr. Stevenson automatically walks on the screen to the right, and your mission is to get him to the end of each level in one piece, while collecting balloons for some ammunition. You also need to shoot enemies and obstacles, so there's a lot you need to keep an eye on. The idea is to collect 5 diamonds to pay the ransom for your kidnapped daughter. But with these kinds of games, the novelty is of bigger value than the plotline. Gumshoe is definitely one of the more interesting zapper games on the NES, but as I've mentioned in an earlier episode, you still need an old CRT television to play these games. Or an emulator. Konami is probably more connected to the arcades and MSX with most of their classic titles, but they did have a few notable games which were perhaps the most celebrated on the Nintendo consoles. Probably the most obvious Konami game people seem to connect to the NES first is Contra, which I came to know first as Gryzor on the Commodore 64, a playable yet sadly inferior port of the arcade original. The funny thing is that C64 and NES versions were released the same month, while the Amstrad and Spectrum conversions were the first to arrive in December 1987. But still, the NES version is what I've played the most. I have to make it clear though, although it is the American version of Contra that I've played the most on the NES, most of the time put into it was on emulators, and the European version, Probotector, is what I have as an original in my collection. Although I think that the number of times which that cartridge has been inside my NES can be counted with one hand's fingers since about 20 years ago. The footage of Contra you see here is being played from an Everdrive cartridge, but I've thrown in some Probotector footage as well, just because it is graphically altered to feature robots instead of soldiers, which makes all the difference. I mean, Contra didn't build its reputation being about 2 tough robots fighting a bunch of other robots. And we have Germany's censorship laws to blame for this. The Contra series is really the ultimate run-and-gun experience, at least before the 32-bit consoles ruined it almost entirely. I would say the two NES games, the Game Boy games and the Super NES one, which was mentioned in an earlier My Nostalgia Trip Games episode, and the Sega Genesis game, are all you need from this series. All the best versions can be played simultaneously with a second player, which makes the games even more epic. But I would strongly urge you to play the first Contra on the NES first, if you're still somehow unfamiliar with the series. It's not just a recommendable game, Contra is a must. Another game I first came across in that games yearbook I mentioned earlier, Cobra Triangle, wasn't of an immediate interest for me. I suppose the name stuck in my mind since first reading it, but I didn't get to try it out until emulation came along. And even then, the early emulators were so undeveloped that none of them would cooperate with Cobra Triangle properly. This, if anything, is what made the game more intriguing for me and prompted me to seek out the game as an original cartridge. Cobra Triangle could be called a speedboat racing game in a similar vein to Rare's earlier hit game RC Pro-Am, but that would be oversimplifying it to the extreme. Having played Cobra Triangle for the first time so that it actually worked properly was an eye-opener. While the isometric viewpoint still reminds me in a bad way of Rare's early adventure games when they were still ultimate play the game, there's so much variety in gameplay that the viewpoint is soon forgotten. Cobra Triangle starts off regularly enough with a racing event where you race through a river against a bunch of other speedboats, although here you can shoot them. Soon enough you'll be disposing mines, riding the boat upstream and avoiding logs and stuff, battling sea monsters and who knows what. Apparently there are 25 different types of levels in Cobra Triangle, but I've never gotten too far in it, due to a severe lack of time to put into this game. But it is a nostalgia trip game in certain ways, regardless of my not actually having played it all that much, and it is a seriously good game too. Another Capcom classic to add to today's list is DuckTales, released in 1989 in North America and 1990 elsewhere. Similarly to Bionic Commando, I wasn't too impressed with the game the first time I saw this through emulation, because I was more in tune with the much more varied DuckTales The Quest for Gold, released on home computers. Of course, when you actually bother to play the game for a minute or two, you realize it's one of the most ingenious platforming adventure games of its time. You play as Scrooge McDuck, collecting as much treasure as he possibly can, and fighting various kinds of generic and familiar Duckburgian enemies. The most characteristic gameplay element in DuckTales is Scrooge's cane, which can be used like a pogo stick to pounce on enemies, hit things with it to reveal secrets, and bounce over hazardous areas. DuckTales was the first in a series of many Capcom-Disney collaborations, unless you count Mickey Mousecapade, which was developed for Hudson Soft. This one just happened to get everything right, and quite deservedly was Capcom's most successful game on the NES. Much like, apparently, the Game Boy version was, respectively. A remastered remake was released for various platforms in 2013, although it offers an expanded experience, and I found the PC version at least to be quite buggy. So much so that I never could actually complete it. So, the NES original is still the preferred way to go. Probably the most entertaining billiards or pool game, if not exactly the most realistic one that I've ever played, is Lunar Pool. This is one of those games you can easily find on various Famiclone systems and pirated multi-game cartridges, which is where I first discovered this game under its original Japanese title, Lunar Ball. Originally released on the NEC PC-88 series and also released on MSX, the NES Famicom version features visuals exclusive to the platform. As you might have guessed by its title, Lunar Pool is not exactly a straight game of pool. The different table shapes are more reminiscent of mini-golf, but the idea is still to pocket all the colored balls on the table and try not to get the cue ball pocketed while at it. This game was a solid time waster when I was doing my music studies in 2001 to 2003 on a borrowed pirate cart, and that's also when I bought my own imported NTSC version. I do find it a bit odd though that the game was actually released so far apart in time in different areas. 1985 in Japan, 1987 in North America, and 1991 in Europe. Oh well, better late than never, I guess. But for me, a multi-game pirate cart is still the only true way of playing Lunar Pool. Lunar Ball. Nostalgia is still a weird thing. Another light gun game here is a fairly late arrival to the genre. To the Earth was actually the first standalone light gun game that I ever bought for my NES, which happened not a year after getting the console itself, around 2002. So that's 20 years ago already. Not my favorite light gun game by any means, but it's another one of those games that I learned about through the yearbook I've mentioned a couple of times in this video already, and it's also easily the most difficult one I've ever played. Now, I should probably explain why this yearbook was such an important factor in these games. The yearbook, which got only released from 1987 to 1991, was published by the same company who published two different monthly magazines about computers, peripherals, program listings and computer game reviews, specifically not console stuff. The inclusion of console games from Sega, Nintendo and even Atari Lynx, since it was the new hot thing back in 1990, in a yearbook with the fan bases entirely in the computer side of gaming, was by the vast majority of readers considered blasphemy, for the lack of a more descriptive word, and they actually dropped the console game reviews from the yearbook in later issues. So the single issue they actually included console games left a strong impression. Now back to the game at hand. Developed by a one-shot wonder, a team called Cirque-Vert in 1989, To the Earth puts you in charge of a spaceship on its way to different planets for retrieving minerals used for fighting an evil race called the Ragosians. And these are the villains you need to fight to get to your destinations and back. The game is presented in a first-person shooter style from the cockpit of your ship, and it's almost like you were playing a formation-based shooter like Gradius or Life Force, but 10 times more frantic. In all honesty, I wouldn't recommend this game to any light gun enthusiast, but it is a unique title in the NES library because it's being the sole game ever developed by Cirque-Vert, as well as being the most difficult game of its kind. An interesting collector's item at best, but as a game, not the most replayable. In my experience, for the NES gamers of my acquaintance, there were only two ice hockey games for the NES. The other one, Blades of Steel, was already mentioned in the second NES episode of my Nostalgia Trip games over 2 years ago, and the other one is Nintendo's own game, simply titled Ice Hockey. It actually reminds me of those old Atari 2600 sport games, which were titled very similarly, as if Nintendo followed Atari's tradition, but then Konami were doing the same thing with their golf and tennis, etc. I have always felt the gameplay in ice hockey is not only much more balanced than in Blades of Steel, but also much more interesting because of the 3 possible body shapes freely selectable for each of the 4 field players. The size of the hockey rink has also been reconsidered accordingly to the number of players. So if you ever thought to hope ice hockey would be a realistic representation of the sport, think again. That's the way I want my sport games to be though, not too serious, not too realistic. Of course, you can also choose your country from a selection of 6. The round time can be chosen between 7, 10 and 15 minutes, and the game speed has 5 different options. As ever, ice hockey is best experienced with another human player, but playing against an AI opponent is adequate enough as well. Despite the lack of separate screen for conducting your fist fights, I have always felt Nintendo's Ice Hockey the better choice over Blades of Steel, and it's one of the most revisited NES games whenever I get to play with my friends. It's a classic, and definitely one of the most replayable games in the entire NES library.